Imagine this. You pick up a prescription at your local pharmacy, and, well, the price tag just makes you wince.
Hmm.
Then you hear that the exact same medication might be available for, I don't know, a fraction of that cost in another country. It's a puzzle, right?
It really is.
How does that happen, and what's being done about it?
Mhm.
It's a complex tapestry woven from pharmaceutical innovation, global supply chains, and, yeah, some seriously big money.
Absolutely.
Today on the Deep Dive, we're diving right into the heart of this puzzle. The US Most Favored Nation drug pricing policy. We're going to try and dissect its ambitious goals, how it's designed to work, and its far-reaching global implications, especially for key player like India, which is, well, an absolute powerhouse in the pharmaceutical world.
That's exactly what we'll do. Based on the recent information, we'll explore how this policy aims to fundamentally shift the pharmaceutical landscape and why understanding it is crucial for, anyone interested in global health, international trade, and these major economic shifts. Our mission, as always, is to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge to help you become truly well-informed on this pretty intricate topic, navigating the nuances and maybe uncovering some surprising facts along the way.
All right, let's start by unpacking this policy itself. What exactly is the U.S. Most Favored Nation drug pricing policy? Now, most favored nation is a term you often hear in trade agreements, meaning countries treat each other equally. But applied to drug prices, it takes on a very specific meaning. It basically aims to compel the U.S. to pay no more for a drug than the lowest price paid by any other nation globally.
Exactly.
This directly addresses that perception, that other countries are essentially getting a free ride on American-financed pharmaceutical innovation.
That's right. The core objective is to stop the U.S. from being, the world's most profitable market for drugs. The broader goals are incredibly ambitious. We're talking about reducing U.S. prescription drug prices by a potential 30 to even 80%.
Wow.
Saving billions for American taxpayers and Medicare, all while trying, and this is key, trying to preserve incentives for genuine pharmaceutical innovation. This actually builds off some of President Trump's earlier efforts to tackle high drug costs.
Okay, so if that's the objective, how does it actually work in practice? How do they plan to make this happen?
It's surprisingly direct in its proposed mechanism, at least on paper. The U.S. would simply mandate that it pays the same price as the lowest price for a particular medicine found anywhere else in the world.
Mandated.
Well, to make it legally binding, there's a proposed bill, the Fair Prescription Drug Prices for Americans Act, introduced by Senators Hawley and Welch. It's bipartisan, importantly.
Okay.
This legislation would explicitly prohibit pharmaceutical companies from selling drugs in the United States at higher prices than the international average. And the teeth of this policy are quite sharp, stiff civil monetary penalties.
Like what would?
We're talking 10 times the difference between the U.S. list price and the average price in key developed nations like Canada, France, Germany, Japan, Italy, and the U.K., calculated per unit sold.
10 times the difference per pill. That's significant.
It is. And another critical piece is bypassing intermediaries. The policy allows for direct-to-consumer sales at these MFN prices, effectively cutting out traditional middlemen like pharmacy benefit managers or PBMs and wholesalers.
Interesting. We'll definitely need to talk more about PBMs.
Okay.
So what's its current status? Is this policy fully implemented, or is it still, in the pipeline?
It's definitely still in motion. This policy was initially signaled by President Trump back in May 2025. Since then, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, released draft guidance for the third cycle of its Medicare drug price negotiation program just last month, May 2025.
Okay.
This cycle is significant because it will, for the first time, include drugs payable under Medicare Part B, expanding its reach beyond Part D drugs.
So doctor-administered drugs, too.
Exactly. We've already seen negotiations for the first set of 10 Part D drugs conclude last August, and the second cycle, covering 15 more Part D drugs, is well underway.
Right.
The third cycle, which will announce up to 15 new drugs, is set for February 2026, with negotiated prices becoming effective January 1st, 2028. There's also a public comment period for this draft guidance closing later this month, June 26, 2025.
That sounds like progress, but given the history of attempts to lower drug prices, I imagine it's not exactly smooth sailing, right? What are the biggest hurdles?
You're absolutely right. Implementation faces significant headwinds. We're seeing legal pushback from pharmaceutical companies, strong industry resistance, and just the sheer complexity of accurately comparing drug prices across different countries.
Yeah, how do you even compare apples to apples with different systems?
Exactly. Different healthcare systems, different rebate structures, different discounts. It's tricky. Similar versions of this policy have actually been blocked in prior attempts. The fine print is still being ironed out, and its long-term viability is, intrinsically linked to the U.S. political landscape and future electoral outcomes. It's a deeply contested area.
This raises a really important question, though. Why are U.S. drug prices, especially for the branded medications, so much higher than in other developed nations in the first place? What makes America the outlier here?
It's a glaring discrepancy. Based on the recent information from 2022, branded specialized drugs in the U.S. were priced at an astonishing 422% of what they cost in other OECD countries.
4 times higher.
Yeah. And all prescription drugs combined in the U.S. were 278% higher. Contrast that with unbranded generics, which were actually lower in the U.S. at just 67% of OECD prices.
Interesting. So generics are cheaper, but brands are way more expensive. Why?
A big part of this difference comes down to the cost of launching drugs. It's about 15% more expensive to launch a patented drug in the U.S. compared to Europe, and a generic drug is roughly 30% more expensive to launch here.
Why is that?
Several reasons. More rigorous regulatory requirements, potentially higher patent litigation disputes for generics, and significantly higher marketing costs. Think about all the direct-to-consumer advertising for patented drugs you see in the U.S.
The TV ads. Yeah, you don't see those elsewhere.
Right. That's a huge cost factor.
But a huge piece of this puzzle, and frankly, where it gets truly frustrating for consumers, lies with those often invisible players, the pharmacy benefit managers, PBMs. How exactly do they, muddy the waters and inflate prices?
PBMs. They started out with a good idea, helping manage drug costs, especially by promoting generics early on, but growing evidence suggests their current practices actually inflate retail generic prices. We're talking about a serious lack of transparency. One example is copay clawbacks.
Clawbacks.
Yeah, where a patient's co-payment for a generic drug can actually exceed the total cost the pharmacy receives for that drug.
Wait, what? You pay more than the drug actually costs?
Exactly. This happened almost a third of the time in one study, with patients overpaying by several dollars on average. And pharmacists were even historically gagged from telling consumers about lower cash prices until that was outlawed in 2018.
That's incredible. So a patient could literally be paying more for their generic prescription than it actually costs the system.
Precisely. Then there's spread pricing.
Okay, what's that?
PBMs reimburse pharmacies one price for dispensing a drug, but they charge the health plan a higher price for that same drug, and they just pocket the difference, the spread.
Wow.
An audit in Ohio, for instance, found an average spread of over 30% on generic prescriptions for Medicaid. That cost taxpayers there hundreds of millions in just 1 year.
So they're making money just by being in the middle?
Essentially, yes. And it gets more complicated with how drug lists, called formularies, are designed. They often favor branded medications that offer lucrative manufacturer rebates to the PBM rather than prioritizing lower-priced generics that might not offer such, kickbacks.
So the formulary isn't always based on the lowest cost for the patient or plan?
Not necessarily. PBMs keep a share of these rebates, and they often charge administrative fees based on a drug's list price, which creates a clear incentive to favor higher-cost drugs that come with bigger rebates or higher list prices.
Unbelievable.
Add to this the fact that the 3 largest PBMs, that's CVS Caremark, Express Scripts, and Optum Rx, control nearly 80% of all retail prescription claims in the U.S.
80%.
Nearly. That gives them immense market power, immense pricing power.
So if we zoom out a bit, it sounds like generics, which should be the ultimate cost-saving heroes. We're talking potentially saving the U.S. health system hundreds of billions annually.
Right. Estimated around $330 billion.
They aren't fully benefiting consumers because these intermediary practices are essentially turning a cost-saving mechanism into a profit center for the middlemen.
Precisely. The savings are often absorbed by intermediaries rather than being passed on effectively to the patients or the overall healthcare system. It's a major distortion.
Okay, let's shift gears and pivot to India now. They are a truly dominant force in the global pharmaceutical landscape. What's their role in all this, especially when we talk about affordable drugs?
India holds a preeminent position globally, particularly as a powerhouse in generic drug manufacturing. They supply a staggering 40% of the generic drug requirements in the U.S.
40%.
40%, and 25% of all medicines consumed in the UK. It's huge. But their influence extends even deeper. India also plays a foundational role in active pharmaceutical ingredient, or API, production.
APIs, those are the core ingredients, right?
Exactly, the core chemical compounds that make drugs work. India has around 500 API producers, accounting for about 8% of the worldwide market. They're fundamental to the supply chain.
So India's contribution to the U.S. market alone must be immense, both in terms of volume and, presumably, cost savings.
It absolutely is. The U.S. is India's primary export destination for pharmaceuticals, absorbing nearly one-third of India's total pharma exports. Based on recent information for fiscal year 2025, these exports breached the $10 billion mark.
$10 billion.
And that's more than doubled since just 2018. The impact is clear in the market share and savings for the U.S. India's share in U.S. prescription drug supply almost doubled from 22% in 2013 to 42% in 2022.
Wow, almost half the prescriptions filled.
Effectively, yes, in terms of volume. And between 2018 and 2022, cumulative savings for the U.S. healthcare system from Indian generic drugs and biosimilars stood at an astonishing $903 billion.
Almost $1 trillion in savings, theoretically.
Theoretically, yes. And several major Indian companies are heavily reliant on the U.S. market. We're talking over half their revenue coming from the U.S. Companies like Gland Pharma, Dr. Reddy's, Aurobindo Pharma. It highlights just how interconnected these pharmaceutical landscapes really are.
Okay, so given India's deep involvement, how does this new MFN policy, which targets lower drug prices in the U.S., ripple through to Indian pharmaceutical companies? Is this a threat, or could it actually be an opportunity for them?
It's a nuanced picture based on recent information. For Indian generics, the expectation is actually limited negative impact. It could even be seen as a tailwind. A tailwind. How so?
Because their margins are already exceptionally thin. They operate in a highly competitive, low-pricing structure already. Some industry executives view the MFN policy as potentially creating new channels for direct-to-government sales, or perhaps increasing overall demand for generics if branded drug prices are forced down significantly.
Interesting.
For example, a company like Biocon, their biosimilars and generics are reportedly already similarly priced in the US and Europe, so an MFN approach might not drastically change their pricing strategy.
So the generic side of India's pharma industry might actually benefit, or at least not be significantly harmed. But what about branded or specialty drugs produced by Indian companies?
That's where the MFN policy could have a major impact. Big Pharma's U.S. profits could drop significantly, potentially 50–60% according to some estimates, hitting branded and specialty drugs really hard.
Okay.
So Indian companies that do have U.S. branded portfolios, Sun Pharma's Illumia as an example, sometimes cited they're particularly exposed to steep margin risks here. The MFN pricing could really squeeze them.
That makes sense. If we connect this to the bigger picture, what does this MFN policy mean for global pricing dynamics beyond just the U.S. market? You mentioned ripples earlier. Could it force drug prices to go up elsewhere?
That's a very real concern, yes. The MFN policy could compel pharmaceutical companies, especially the big multinational ones, to increase drug prices in other international markets to try and recoup some of the potential losses from the U.S.
A global rebalancing, but not necessarily downwards everywhere.
Exactly. It could create this ripple effect across pharmaceutical markets worldwide. This could clash directly with existing price controls in countries like India, potentially leading to reduced availability or delayed launches of new, innovative drugs in those markets.
And what about R&D, research and development?
That's another major concern. With lower expected returns in the lucrative U.S. market, companies might scale back investment in risky or niche innovations globally. Less incentive to go for the moonshots, perhaps. This could also deter Indian firms themselves from investing heavily in developing their own high-margin specialty drugs, potentially affecting their long-term innovation strategy.
But is there any upside to this for India in the global picture? Perhaps in other parts of the pharmaceutical value chain?
Absolutely. On a more positive note, there's a potential significant opportunity for contract research organizations, or CROs, and contract development and manufacturing organizations, CDMOs.
Research and manufacturing partners.
Right. As R&D is a major cost component for pharma companies, if profits are squeezed, they will likely look even harder for more cost-effective ways to conduct research and manufacturing.
And India is well positioned there.
Very well positioned. Due to their robust talent pool, growing scientific expertise, and the large number of U.S. FDA-approved manufacturing sites, Indian CROs and CDMOs could see a significant boost in business. Big pharma and biotech might increase outsourcing to India to save costs.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, this whole situation is obviously deeply intertwined with broader trade and intellectual property discussions between the U.S. and India. What are the key points of contention and negotiation that shape this relationship?
Yeah, trade is a big part of this. Historically, the U.S. has imposed tariffs. There was a general 10% universal tariff on imports mentioned, and even a specific reciprocal tariff on Indian goods, although that latter one was suspended for a time, until July 2025 based on recent info.
So trade tensions exist.
They do, but the real high stakes are in the ongoing Bilateral Trade Agreement, or BTA, negotiations. Both countries are aiming to elevate bilateral trade to an ambitious $500 billion by 2030.
Wow, $500 billion.
It's a big goal. And India has put forth several strategic counterproposals in these talks, particularly around pharmaceuticals.
What kinds of proposals? Are they trying to protect their pharmaceutical sector, leverage their strength?
Exactly. India is seeking broad tariff exemptions for pharmaceutical products exported to the U.S. They're also offering to supply generic medicines at significantly reduced prices, maybe 20–25% of current branded prices, but specifically after originator patents expire.
Okay.
They're also proposing increased manufacturing of APIs in the U.S., potentially addressing some supply chain concerns. And significantly, they're considering reforms to their own intellectual property laws to address U.S. concerns regarding things like evergreening practices, while also seeking greater access for themselves to critical advanced technologies from the U.S.
You mentioned evergreening and intellectual property, or IP, earlier. Can you just quickly clarify what those terms mean in this specific context? It seems crucial.
Of course. Intellectual property rights, IPR, are a huge area of discussion, maybe even tension. The U.S. is actively pushing for stronger IP protections, sometimes called TRIPS Plus measures.
Stronger than the global standard.
Yes, protections that go beyond the standard World Trade Organization TRIPS agreement. This often means things like longer patent terms or stricter enforcement, which could potentially delay generic drug entry into the market.
And evergreening.
Evergreening is a practice or an accusation, depending on your perspective, where pharmaceutical companies make minor changes to an existing drug, maybe a new formulation or delivery method, and try to get a new patent for it. This can effectively extend their monopoly long after the original patent on the core molecule should have expired.
Ah, I see. Keeping generics off the market longer.
That's the concern. India's robust generic sector naturally thrives on timely patent expiry. So there's this inherent tension. The U.S. often pushes for stronger IP to promote innovation, while India prioritizes public health access through quicker generic availability. It's a balancing act.
A very tricky balancing act. So, with all these pressures, the MFN policy, trade talks, IP issues, and also the opportunities like CDMO growth, how is India strategically responding to navigate this really evolving global landscape?
India is taking I'd say, a multi-pronged approach. Domestically, they're reassessing their own drug pricing strategies to try and insulate their pharmaceutical companies and, importantly, their patient population from potential adverse impacts spilling over from policies like MFN.
Okay. And looking outwards.
Internationally, the Make in India initiative is key. It aims to gain a competitive edge, particularly as a manufacturing alternative to China, bolstering India's self-reliance and attractiveness as a global production hub for more than just generics.
Building resilience.
Exactly. Furthermore, India is actively pursuing a diversification strategy for its pharmaceutical exports. They're working hard to reduce their reliance on the U.S. market, even though it's huge, by expanding into other markets like the UK, Brazil, France, South Africa, Canada, and more.
Spreading the risk.
Precisely. This also includes a focus on what's called South-South cooperation, strengthening ties and trade with other developing countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America.
That's a comprehensive strategy. So, stepping back, what's the long-term outlook for India's role in global pharma as these dynamics continue to play out? Do they just remain the pharmacy of the world for generics?
I think India is strategically positioning itself to be seen as more than that. Yes, a reliable, high-quality, and affordable global pharmaceutical supplier remains core, but this period of transformation offers India the chance to evolve, to move beyond being merely the generic pharmacy of the world, which is still incredibly important, towards becoming a more integrated, innovative, and indispensable global pharmaceutical hub.
More integrated, more innovative.
Yeah, potentially moving up the value chain in R&D, complex manufacturing, biosimilars. It signifies a strategic choice for the future trajectory of India's pharmaceutical sector, aiming for greater resilience, cost-effectiveness, and maybe a broader role in a shifting global landscape.
What a fascinating deep dive. We've really unpacked a lot. We've seen how the U.S. MFN policy aims to radically cut drug prices, how incredibly complex the current pricing system is, especially due to those opaque intermediaries, the PBMs, and India's immense, truly indispensable role in the global generic market, providing so much volume.
And we've also explored the really nuanced impacts on Indian pharma, highlighting both the potential opportunities for their strong generic sector and the definite challenges for any branded exports they have to the U.S. Plus, the ongoing trade and intellectual property negotiations shaping this crucial, deeply interconnected relationship.
The whole pharmaceutical landscape is clearly shifting beneath our feet, isn't it? Driven by policy, by trade negotiations, by powerful economic incentives. Understanding these forces helps you, the listener, see the bigger picture behind the headlines, making sense of why your prescription costs what it does, and how policies made in Washington can literally change access to medicine for people thousands of miles away.
And as you reflect on this, maybe consider how innovations in one part of the world or these kinds of policy shifts in another can create such unforeseen ripples, fundamentally reshaping access to vital medicines for millions, maybe billions globally. It really makes you wonder, what new models might emerge from all this? Can we find a way that truly balances the need for pharmaceutical innovation with the absolute necessity of widespread affordability for everyone, ensuring that life-saving drugs are actually within reach for those who need them most, regardless of where they happen to live?